Yeah.
Those gold and
Cards,
silver.
chips. I want to see like flashy Vegas. I want it to be tacky like mall.
There is a particular kind of television success that nobody can manufacture on purpose. Networks try constantly. They commission focus groups, they test formats, they hire consultants who promise they know exactly what audiences want, and most of the time the result is forgettable. Then, every once in a while, a small production crew walks into a family-owned bakery in a New Jersey city most Americans couldn't have located on a map, and something genuinely unrepeatable happens. That is the story of Cake Boss, and it is also the story of Buddy Valastro, a man who became one of the most recognizable faces in American reality television, lost almost everything that had made his rise possible, and rebuilt his career using little more than stubbornness, family loyalty, and a hand that had been rebuilt 5 separate times. This is the story of how a bakery became an empire, how that empire nearly came apart, and how the man at the center of it kept going anyway. Carlo's Bake Shop had existed in Hoboken, New Jersey long before any camera crew ever walked through its doors. Buddy Valastro's father, Buddy Sr., had purchased the shop in the 1960s, and it had operated for decades as exactly the kind of neighborhood institution that exists in every working-class city in America. A place people walk to on Saturday mornings, a place that catered weddings and communions and birthdays, a place whose reputation traveled by word of mouth rather than advertising. When Buddy Sr. died of cancer in 1994, his teenage son Buddy Jr. left high school to take over daily operations of the bakery, inheriting not just a business but an entire family's expectations. By the time TLC came calling in the late 2000s, Carlo's had already built a strong local reputation for elaborate custom cake work, but nobody involved seemed to think they were building the foundation of a television franchise. Cake Boss premiered in the spring of 2009, and it did not arrive with a marketing blitz or a celebrity-studded launch. It found its audience the old-fashioned way, through people who happened to catch an episode and could not stop describing it to friends. The premise itself was almost aggressively simple. Follow a family bakery as it built increasingly outlandish custom cakes while the family that ran it argued, joked, and occasionally exploded at each other in ways that felt uncomfortably real. What separated Cake Boss from the wave of competitive cooking and baking shows that had already colonized cable television was the absence of artifice. There was no elimination round. Nobody was voted off. The stakes were not manufactured through a game show structure but through the actual pressure of running a business with real deadlines, real clients, and real money on the line. When a wedding cake had to be finished by a specific hour on a specific Saturday, the tension on screen was not performed for the cameras. It was the tension of an actual small business trying not to disappoint an actual bride. The cakes themselves supplied the visual hook that got new viewers to sample an episode. Valastro and his team built a working motorcycle out of cake and fondant. They recreated architectural landmarks in sugar. They constructed pieces so structurally ambitious that watching them survive transport to a venue became its own form of suspense. But the cakes were never really the reason people kept returning week after week. The reason was the Valastro family itself, Buddy's sisters, Grace, Mary, Madalena, and Lisa, each occupying a distinct role and a distinct personality within the shop, the brothers-in-law who worked alongside them, and above all Buddy's mother, a woman the audience quickly came to know simply as Mama Valastro. She was not manufactured for television. She was the actual matriarch of an actual immigrant family, and her presence gave the show an emotional gravity that competitive baking formats could never replicate, because there was no format to it at all. It was simply a family, doing what families do, with a camera crew capturing the results. The success of Cake Boss did not stay contained to a single television timeslot. Within a few years of its premiere, TLC and the Valastro family had built an entire constellation of related programming around the original show. Next Great Baker turned the format into a talent competition. Kitchen Boss moved the setting into Buddy's own home kitchen. Bakery Boss sent him out to rescue struggling independent bakeries in a format reminiscent of the restaurant rescue shows that had become popular around the same period. Each spin-off extended the Cake Boss brand into a slightly different corner of the baking television landscape, and each one kept Buddy Valastro's face in front of an audience that had grown well beyond the tri-state area. The most tangible consequence of the show's popularity showed up on the streets of Hoboken itself. The original Carlo's Bake Shop location on Washington Street became something closer to a landmark than a local business. Fans who had watched the show from other states, and in plenty of cases from other countries, made a point of visiting when they came through the New York metropolitan area. Lines formed outside the shop on ordinary weekday afternoons. A gift shop selling branded merchandise became almost as central to the operation as the cake counter itself. City officials in Hoboken openly credited the show with drawing a steady stream of visitors who had no other particular reason to detour into a mid-sized New Jersey city, and for a stretch of years, Cake Boss functioned as a genuine piece of the local tourism economy. Riding that momentum, the Valastro operation expanded well beyond its Hoboken roots. New locations opened in New York, in Las Vegas inside the Venetian Resort, and eventually on the West Coast in California. It was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable trajectory for a business that had started as a single neighborhood storefront run by an Italian immigrant family. But rapid expansion built on the momentum of a television show carries a particular kind of risk. A business that grows because a camera crew is documenting it is, to some extent, tethered to the fortunes of that show. When the show falters, the foundation underneath the expansion can begin to shift, and the first signs that this might eventually become a problem showed up earlier than most viewers realized. Long before ratings became a concern, the Cake Boss brand ran into a legal complication that had nothing to do with baking and everything to do with the name itself. In 2010, just a year after the show debuted, a company called Masters Software filed a legal challenge against Valastro and Discovery Communications, TLC's parent company. Masters Software had been selling business management software marketed to professional bakers under the name Cake Boss since 2007, 2 full years before the television show existed. The company's founders argued that the show's use of an essentially identical name was creating confusion in the marketplace and diluting a brand they had built first. The dispute drew press coverage and briefly raised the possibility that one of television's fastest-rising shows might have to rebrand entirely. The matter was eventually resolved without a name change, but it served as an early signal that a family bakery had, almost overnight, become the kind of commercial entity that attracts exactly the sort of legal exposure small businesses rarely have to think about. The show also generated its share of tabloid-style controversy over the years, driven largely by the same quality that made it compelling in the first place: an emotionally expressive, tightly wound Italian-American family working in close quarters, all of them fully invested in the outcome of everything happening around them. Moments that played as entertaining television in the moment sometimes read differently in retrospect, and the show occasionally found itself the subject of the same kind of coverage typically reserved for daytime talk show blow-ups rather than a family bakery program. More significant than any single controversy was the way the broader television landscape shifted underneath Cake Boss as the years went on. When the show premiered in 2009, there was genuinely nothing else quite like it. By the middle of the decade, that had changed dramatically. The Great British Bake Off had become an international phenomenon. Nailed It had carved out its own audience with a comedic, lower-stakes approach to baking competition. The Food Network was running multiple baking competition formats simultaneously. None of these shows were doing exactly what Cake Boss did, but collectively they diluted the sense that Cake Boss was offering something audiences could not find anywhere else. Ratings, which had been strong through the show's early seasons, began a slow decline that had nothing to do with any single misstep and everything to do with a media environment that had simply caught up to what had once been a novel idea. Then, in 2017, the Valastro family faced a loss that no amount of television success could soften. Mary Valastro, known to millions of viewers simply as Mama Valastro, had been diagnosed with a myotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Born in Altamura, Italy in 1948, she had immigrated to the United States with her husband and raised her children inside the family bakery, becoming, in the eyes of the show's audience, the emotional center of everything Carlos represented. ALS is a progressive disease that attacks the nerve cells controlling voluntary muscle movement, and it offers no cure and typically a short, unforgiving timeline between diagnosis and death. Mary Valastro died in 2017, and the loss registered immediately and visibly in her son's life and, by extension, in the show itself. Buddy Valastro stepped away from Cake Boss for roughly 2 years following his mother's death. The show continued to air, filming at Carlos' bake shop without him at the center of it, but the absence was impossible to disguise. Buddy had never simply been the host of the program. He had been its emotional architecture, the person whose relationship to his late father's legacy and his ailing mother's presence gave every storyline its underlying weight. A version of Cake Boss without Buddy Valastro at the center was, in a fairly literal sense, a different show wearing the same name. He returned in 2019, but the landscape he returned to had shifted while he was gone. Ratings that had declined during his absence never fully recovered. The competitive pressure from other baking programs had only intensified. And whatever stability the show might have found in 2019 and early 2020 was about to be tested by two entirely separate crises that arrived within weeks of each other. One affecting the entire world, and one that happened privately, in Buddy Valastro's own basement. In early 2020, COVID-19 shut down virtually every business in America that depended on foot traffic, and Carlo's Bake Shop, a business whose entire commercial identity had become tied to its status as a destination people traveled specifically to visit, was about as vulnerable to that kind of disruption as a business could be. The lines that had once stretched down the block in Hoboken disappeared. Out-of-town visitors who had built entire day trips around a Carlo's stop stopped coming altogether. The Las Vegas location, which relied heavily on casino and convention traffic, went quiet along with the rest of the Strip. The New York location sat in a city that, for a period in 2020, became one of the hardest-hit places in the entire country. Cake Boss went on production hiatus that year and never returned with new episodes on its original network. There was no single dramatic cancellation announcement. The combination of declining ratings, pandemic disruption, and a broader contraction in appetite for expansion simply made ending the show's regular run the path of least resistance. Then, in September of 2020, disaster struck again, this time in a form that had nothing to do with television economics. Buddy Valastro was at his family's New Jersey home, spending time with his children near the home bowling alley he had installed on the property, when a malfunction occurred in the bowling lane's pinsetter mechanism. As he tried to clear a jammed pin from the cage assembly, his right hand became lodged and compressed inside the machine. A metal rod roughly an inch and a half long slowly and repeatedly drove through his hand, piercing it multiple times between his ring finger and middle finger. He was unable to free himself. More than 5 minutes passed before his teenage sons and a family member managed to cut him loose using a reciprocating saw. He was rushed into emergency surgery, the first of what would eventually become a 5-surgery ordeal stretched across the next several years. The injury landed on the one part of his body his entire career depended on. In the immediate aftermath, Valastro told interviewers he was not certain the precision and control that had defined his decorating work would ever fully return. For a man whose public identity, family business, and financial security were all built directly on the specific dexterity of his hands, that uncertainty carried a weight that went beyond an ordinary injury. His wife Lisa pushed back publicly against that fatalism almost immediately, telling reporters that he would decorate cakes again even if it meant relearning the craft with his left hand, and that people should trust her on that. She turned out to be right, though the road there was neither quick nor simple. Recovery unfolded in stages that stretched across roughly 5 years. Early updates described modest, painstaking progress, first measured in the ability to make a fist, later in a rough percentage of restored strength that climbed slowly with each round of physical therapy. By 2021, he was describing significant improvement. By the following year, he was back in front of cameras and back in the kitchen, decorating again, even if the process looked different than it had before the accident. The medical story did not end quickly, however. A third surgery followed the first two. A fourth followed that. In October 2025, 5 years and 1 month after the original accident, Valastro underwent his fifth and what he described as his final surgery, aimed specifically at correcting a tendon that had healed improperly and left one finger permanently curled. He documented the update himself on social media, describing renewed strength, restored functionality, and a level of relief that came only after 5 separate operations spread across half a decade. Even 6 years removed from the original accident, he has acknowledged that certain small movements in that hand still don't fully cooperate, a lingering, almost wry reminder of what that single night in his basement cost him. While Buddy Valastro was rebuilding his hand one surgery at a time, the business empire built around his name was going through its own transformation. At its broadest point, the Carlo's Bake Shop brand had extended into New Jersey, New York, Texas, Nevada, and California, along with international ventures, anchored by a Las Vegas location inside the Venetian that benefited both from Strip foot traffic and from visitors who had specifically sought out the Cake Boss connection. The years following the pandemic and the end of the show's original run brought a real and visible contraction. The Santa Monica location on California's 3rd Street Promenade closed its physical storefront in late 2023, though rather than abandoning that market entirely, the business pivoted to an e-commerce model, shipping orders instead of maintaining a retail footprint there. By 2025, the sprawling multi-location empire of the show's peak years had settled into a smaller, more concentrated footprint, roughly a half-dozen locations nationally, with the original Hoboken shop still serving as the flagship and still drawing tourists on the strength of its history, a Times Square location functioning as much as an experience destination as a working bakery. and the Las Vegas outpost continuing to benefit from resort and casino traffic. That contraction, though, was not simply retreat. Valastro found genuinely creative ways to keep the brand present even without the scale of its earlier expansion. He introduced automated cake ATM vending kiosks in select locations, allowing customers to buy slices of Carlo's signature cakes around the clock without a staffed storefront behind the transaction. His restaurant ventures, including Buddy V's Ristorante in Las Vegas, remained part of the operation's footprint, and as the demands of a weekly television production eased, those hospitality projects took on a more central role in how the business generated revenue. Perhaps the most significant shift was where Valastro chose to put his energy once the traditional television model stopped being reliable. Rather than waiting for a network to commission new episodes, he built a substantial direct presence on social media platforms, connecting with an audience that had followed him since 2009 without a broadcast schedule standing between them. In one widely shared moment in December of 2025, he posted a video of himself decorating an elaborate cake entirely blindfolded, a stunt that doubled as both entertainment and a quiet, pointed reminder that the specific manual skill that had once been in question after his accident was, by that point, fully intact. The format around him had changed considerably. The person underneath it had not. What Buddy Valastro built after Cake Boss. The end of Cake Boss's original network run did not mean the end of Buddy Valastro's television career, even if what came next looked different from the family bakery format that had made him famous. He moved to Food Network for a stretch, appearing in Buddy vs. Duff, a head-to-head competition series pitting him against fellow celebrity cake artist Duff Goldman, along with a holiday-themed spin-off, Buddy vs. Christmas. The competitive format was a departure from the ensemble family dynamic of the original show, but it kept him working on a major food-focused network and in front of an audience that had never entirely lost interest. In 2022, he returned to something closer to the original Cake Boss format with Buddy Valastro's Cake Dynasty on A&E, a show that brought back the combination of ambitious cake construction and unfiltered family dynamics that had defined the original series at its best. The show ran for a single 10-episode season and was not renewed for a second, though all 10 episodes remain available for viewers to find on A&E, Hulu, and Disney+. Even in its brief run, the show earned real recognition, taking home a Daytime Emmy Award in 2024, a genuine acknowledgement that the specific creative instincts that had made him a star in 2009 were still fully intact when he was given the right platform to use them.